Antonia Pizzi, in her talk, already mentioned the term virtuous virus, and that raises a question which I'm going to start with today in looking at reception. Dare we still speak of a virtuous virus? The current pandemic has made everybody, not just microbiologists, familiar with terms such as super spreader and R factor, and our churches are no exception to this. And not only do we see concerns across traditions as to what Christian practice might look like in a post-pandemic world, but some missional initiatives have been quick to ask, how well are we infecting people for Christ? What's our evangelistic R factor? I'm not entirely sure how useful this language is, but did remind me that at the third Receptive Ecumenical Conference in Fairfield University in 2014, Paul Murray proposed a novel way of thinking about this approach as a virtuous virus. Now, on understanding receptive ecumenism as virtuous, we need look no further than Antonia Pizzi's work. But why a virus? At Fairfield, Paul was reflecting on the way that receptive ecumenism had adapted since its inception, mutating, as it were, into new variants. But there's a bit more that can be said on this. And I mentioned some of this at the fourth conference in Canberra. A journal in the 2015 Journal of Virology talked about a mutually beneficial viruses and what their characteristics were. I'll just put some of them up here. So if we dive a little deeper into Paul's metaphor in the light of this, we can have an illustration of how receptive ecumenism not only mutates and adapts, but does so through responding to stresses in its environments. That is, its wounds and dysfunctions, to use the language of receptive ecumenism, and informing mutually beneficial relationships with its host, in which not only does the host tradition benefit from receptive ecumenism as a tool, but that tool itself is developed and refined through being adopted and experienced in different traditions. I'm not going to labor the point here, but this slide illustrates the kind of things I'm talking about that enrich that language of the virtuous virus. And it might be useful to keep it in mind as we look at the reception of receptive ecumenism. Now, the key question on receiving receptive ecumenism was asked by Paul Avis in 2012, and he wrote an article called "Are We Receiving Receptive Ecumenism?" I've given a fairly detailed response to this recently, which looks at the recent evidence of reception in the churches, academy, and ecumenical bodies. But for today's purposes, I'm going to talk more generally about the reception in different traditions before briefly asking, where next? So which traditions have taken notice and brought receptive ecumenism into their thought and practice? In 2012, Paul Avis stressed how important it was for this to be more than a Catholic movement. Since then, it's become clear that it has indeed been adopted across a range of traditions, in teaching, in practice, in scholarship. Catholic receptions are by no means lacking, from Avery Dulles to Walter Casper, and including two popes, not just Pope Francis, but also Benedict XVI. But we also see receptions that either in their origin or in their application are Anglican, Methodist, Reformed, Lutheran, Baptist, Evangelical, Free Church, Indigenous, Pentecostal. And whilst there's no formal references, as far as I'm aware, to receptive ecumenism in Orthodox formal ecumenical statements, individual theologians have certainly engaged with it, with some scholars noticing a very interesting resonance with concepts such as open subbonicity. Encouragingly, therefore, this reception, what we can see in the literature, has not been restricted to churches with a strong global, regional, or national ecclesial structure and a corresponding history of formal ecumenical dialogues. I think this is an important point. Now, certainly it's significant when Archbishop Justin Welby, in his address to the 70th anniversary of the World Council of Churches, talked of one of the most important of recent ecumenical developments. Or less dramatically, but I think even more significantly, the Catholic Church quietly recognizes a development in its understanding of ecumenism beyond a simple exchange of gifts to a more self-critical willingness to learn, in keeping with Pope Francis's understanding of the whole church as a learning church. But equally, there have been impressive receptions by churches with more localized structures, and sometimes without a history of formal ecumenism. The former is well illustrated in the work of Paul Fiddes, for example, or Stephen Harmon's Baptist Identity and the Ecumenical Future, which has 2 excellent chapters on receptive ecumenism. Nevertheless, at the second Receptive Ecumenical Conference in 2009, Pentecostal Bishop Joe Aylward asked, "Where are my brothers and sisters from the Black Pentecostal churches?" A question echoed more generally by Larry Miller, then Secretary of the Global Christian Forum in 2014, when he gently asked who was missing from the receptive ecumenical table. Nonetheless, Miller recognized the potential of the approach, not just for churches traditionally involved in ecumenism, and has very recently praised Gabrielle Thomas's work, which we'll hear about later, commenting that her work on receptive ecumenism points a way forward for many of the conversations in the Global Christian Forum's unfolding journey of mutual love. Pentecostal movements can, of course, be found in all kinds of ecclesial structures, from new churches to historic free churches to global Catholicism. And other writers in this broad tradition have recognized receptive ecumenism as, quoting Andy Lord, are particularly appropriate for Pentecostal ecumenism. And that's not least because of the central place it affords the Holy Spirit, as Tony said earlier. Now, focused initially here on individual traditions, partly because receptive ecumenism is orientated first towards addressing problems in one's own tradition, rather than directly looking to overcome things that impair communion with each other. But receptive ecumenism is not only being received by individual traditions. Archic 3 is perhaps the most high-profile example of it playing a developing role in all kinds of ecumenical relationships. But that role is also noted in a wide range now of local and ecumenical conversations. I'll just put some of them up here. And although there isn't time to go into it in detail, it's very important not to miss the significant pastoral receptions, which we can see examples of particularly in Australia and Sweden and in the UK. So briefly then, given all of that, where next? Geographically, there have been significant receptions in English-speaking countries, in the UK, in Australia, Canada, America, and South Africa, and increasingly in Europe, especially in Scandinavia. But reception of receptive ecumenism in the global south is in its infancy. There have been some very interesting reflections. I'm delighted to see Paul Pullican is here, on the African, Asian, and Latin American context. But the distinctive variants of receptive ecumenism that might flourish in those environments or address particular stresses there, I think are still to fully mature. That said, even where reception of receptive ecumenism goes back a decade or more, the praxis of integrating and transforming at different levels of the church remains a real challenge. In the Catholic Church, my own church, for example, synodality is currently recognized as a pressing concern, highly visible at all levels of the church. But despite the literature on receptive ecumenism regularly citing this as an area where the Catholic Church might make good use of ecumenical learning, for example, in Walking Together in the Way, substantive engagement with that ecumenical learning has not yet made a significant mark in the emerging and blossoming Catholic literature or practice on synodality so far. More widely, if receptive ecumenism is around wounds and transformation, rather than simply ecumenical or church dividing issues, then it constantly needs to be reading the signs of the times, race, gender, climate, to name just three. There's a relatively small amount of literature looking at those issues in a receptive ecumenical model so far. But also, and not unrelated to this, is the ecclesial learning needed in the wake of the present vicious rather than virtuous virus. In the aftermath of COVID-19, churches need not only instrumental learning, picking the pieces up, but healing of systematic and systemic wounds which have been uncovered, the people we don't reach or didn't reach before the pandemic, the underlying structures of power revealed when liturgy is switched online, the need for genuine local presence and ministry may be challenging us to think of new forms or understand in new ways. Here are new questions, new opportunities for receptive ecumenism to really show its mettle as a virtuous virus in a changing world.